I think we can agree that was not a good night for America last night, right? Welcome into my state of mind. I am Dan York. My guest tonight, retired Lieutenant General, Adjutant General Reginald Centracchio, and it's timely that I've got him in here, A, because he's expert on things like defense, and our Secretary of Defense just offered his resignation, perhaps not so voluntarily, yesterday, and then, of course, all of our news in the last cycle is about Ferguson, and he's got insight, I'm sure, as to security matters, National Guard call-ins, when a state governor says, you know what, I'm taking over the whole operation, which didn't seemingly go so well last night. So stay tuned for that. And certainly what happened last night is a theme for our discussion on the rundown, so let's get right to it if we can. I thought last night was bound to happen. I've been saying that on the radio and the television here for a long time, and I blame politicians, pretty serious ones, pretty high-level ones on this. And of course, it's always his time, because he's got to get in the middle of all these conversations, doesn't he? And we have a little bit of a protest here in Providence tonight, which the authorities expect will be of a different tone, we hope. In fact, it's probably going on as we speak. And your state of mind is important to us, so let's dig in here and just take a look-see at what we've got headline-wise. And again, yeah, bound to happen. Listen, here's the headline. It hardly needs to be read. I mean, there's only 1 million of them as we speak. Let me, before I say what I have to say, just give you a little bit of a, in case you were, I don't know, under a rock last night somewhere or watching football instead. I don't even know how you could have done that with the feeling that America was in a little bit of a crisis last night. Here's CBS's little bit of a summary.
Burned out businesses smoldered following a night of chaos in Ferguson, Missouri. Rioting broke out after a county prosecutor announced that 9 white and 3 African-American jurors decided not to indict police officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown in August. Their decision was based on 70 hours of testimony from about 60 witnesses. President Obama called for peaceful demonstrations, but the situation quickly got out of hand as roaming groups of demonstrators, some from outside the area, rampaged through the neighborhood, firing shots, breaking windows, and destroying businesses. Police responded with tear gas.
Now, I'm not going to make any gratuitous comments about the looting and the damage. I can't walk in the shoes or the mind or the psychology of somebody who takes a baseball bat to a hamburger joint over this whole thing. I don't even know what to say about it, and I'm not going to pretend I know. I know this, though. This president has responsibility for this. Here he was last night.
There's never an excuse for violence, particularly when there are a lot of people in goodwill out there who are willing to work on these issues. On the other hand, those who are only interested in focusing on the violence and just want the problem to go away need to recognize that we do have work to do here, and we shouldn't try to paper it over. Whenever we do that, the anger may momentarily subside, but over time it builds up, and America isn't everything that it could be.
I mean, so he's talking. I'm watching, like many of you were probably watching any one of the networks last night, and all of them were split screening the president and the violence. And it was kind of like, all due respect, Mr. President, could you just be quiet? It was symbolic and ironic in a way. His forecast that family needed justice, the Attorney General's forecast that family needed justice, the Governor of Missouri's forecast that family needed justice, brought you last night, because the only justice that they could have gotten was an indictment. So the meddling by this president, the pedestrian nature of this president is dangerous, and he doesn't seem to know. And he just talks and talks and talks, and I thought it was symbolic last night as he was split screened, and everyone was watching the other side of the screen while he was just going on and on. I don't even know I don't know what the remedy is. The guy loves to hear himself. Let's move on. Next item. And speaking of, there's a lot of people that love to hear themselves. And you'd say, well, Dan, you're the fat guy on the television that loves to hear himself. You talk all the time. Yeah, but you know what? I ain't no Al Sharpton, that's for sure. I'm no President Obama either. But here's the thing. It's not about me. It's about Al. It's always about Al.
Last night, the appearance by the district attorney made it clear to everyone why we had little faith in a state prosecution. I've been out involved in civil rights all my life. We have seen cases go ways that we felt were right and ways that we felt was wrong. I've never seen a prosecutor hold a press conference to discredit the victim.
Well, you know, everyone's got a perspective, and you look at through your own rose-colored glasses, your own prism. You know, they were very upset that the prosecutor did a data dump, meaning throwing all the evidence in front of the grand jury because it was too much for them to go through. If it didn't come out the way they wanted to, they would have said, you know what, and he only offered limited data or witness testimony, it would have been he didn't give enough of the file. These arguments are never going to be won, by the way. This perspective will always be different, by the way, because there are agendas here. Now look, when it comes to policing and fairness and all of that, there are legitimate conversations that need to be had, and I think most police departments who are objective know that from profiling right on down, there's a lot of work to be done. I don't know how much work gets done off the rhetoric from the Al Sharptons of the world. And the next item is about tonight. There's a protest. I don't know very much about it, and it's probably happening as we speak. It was scheduled for 7 o'clock. News throughout Rhode Island today was kind of previewing the idea that we've got a 7 o'clock thing. Providence After Dark day after announcement, Central High School, the Ferguson National Response Network. The mayor was saying that he expects it to be loud but safe. That's what the First Amendment is about. Loud but safe. Let's cross our fingers. That's the way it's going to go, and we'll cover that tomorrow when we find out what was said. Your state of mind is important to us. You dial us at 228-1886. You email us at stateofmind@myritv.com. Tweet, Facebook post. Here's what one person posted here on our Facebook page. The decision not to indict the officer is because there was no evidence. You know, you're yelling when you capitalize. To support an indictment. Get over it, Rhode Island. You have bigger issues to worry about than spending your time protesting. Now, Christine, that's not very fair either, because we live on the First Amendment. Folks ought to be able to protest as long and as loudly as they want to. They ought to keep the liquor store intact, and the hamburger joint really doesn't need to be beaten in. And people's businesses in a town like Ferguson, where their whole lives have been invested, need to survive the day, and they weren't. When we come back, I'll ask the General, how do you protect a town like that? Not easy. Stay with us. Welcome back in. You've seen the headlines. They're from, every newspaper in America has got vivid pictures and the like. We've got one here, of course, no indictment from the Missourian, and it was pretty stressful last night. You've seen all of the video, the fires and the looting and all that kind of thing. And Governor Jay Nixon, more or less in the afternoon, said, all right, we got this. And he called in the equivalent of what used to be when he wasn't retired, or Lieutenant General Reginald Centracchio. Welcome, sir. Always great to have you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Short perspective on what you saw last night.
What I saw last night was an execution of a plan that had a lot of holes in it. You can have a plan, you can be ready to exercise that plan, you can fully train, but there has to be some reciprocity on the part of the community that you're trying to protect too. Where you have an absence of respect for not only law enforcement, but certainly the military and any authority, which appeared to me to be the case in the case with busting windows and so on and so forth. That brings into it a whole new perspective of how do you deal with that. I think you saw much of it just being allowed to happen, because you're not going to step in the middle of that and arrest somebody for breaking a window and have 10 other people come in and break more windows. So I think you got a balance about how do you exercise the authority you need to have without going beyond that.
They arrested some 60 plus 80. It was 60 early, 80 later, and I'm not exactly sure how that whole thing went. It must have been an interesting night at the cells at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning last night. But what I was interested in is the governor's strategy. For all intents and purposes, he reportedly took the local command and control away from the Ferguson police, and even the state police were working with the National Guard and the whole thing. How does that work? That's not easy, because law enforcement agencies are rivalrous, aren't they, in many ways?
Are. When you attempt to use a political solution to a tactical problem, you always run into the dilemma and the challenge. You cannot exercise a well thought out plan. You cannot have police military, and everyone working to achieve a reasonable end result on a crowd control. We have a political entity trying to control that from a political point of view. I think you can apply that all the way back to Vietnam. When you try to introduce a political solution to a military strategy, it doesn't work. And I think that was part of the problem last night, where you've got to be able to give the resources, give personnel, give a mission, and step out of the way. Clearly, that didn't happen last night.
Yeah, some folks were suggesting that the place could have been better protected. I'm not sure I'm in a position to even make a judgment on that. Are you?
You can't protect buildings, as an example. You can't protect someone who's intent on doing damage unless you put yourself in a position to stop it by not allowing them to get to the building. Then you have a brand new set of rules of engagement. I think to some extent they allowed that to happen because the alternative was to arrest everybody there with very little semblance of reason why in their mind. You know, that was their idea of perhaps showing they're totally disenchanted with, in their mind, what justice should have been.
I wonder what conversations may or may not have gone on between the governor's office, the command and control on what they knew would be a tenuous situation, and the prosecutor, and the decision at 9 o'clock to offer this news on a no true bill. I mean, I would think they could have kept the grand jury quiet and protected until this morning, and at 9 o'clock this morning introduced the information, and perhaps the light of day would have been a little bit more of a buffer. Yes? No?
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think the methodology that went into that decision had much to do with making sure that the children coming out of schools during the day or any time during the day, there's a lot of traffic on the road, a lot of trafficability as it relates to safety. The second area had to do with making sure you're positioning your forces not prematurely. At the same time, you need to give the ability for business owners, as they did, to determine whether they're going to stay open or not. You close too early, you're going to get the same kind of results that you did with some of the businesses that decided to stay open.
I was just thinking the light of day might have been a little bit more of a protection, because nighttime, for some reason, seems to breed people operating in the shadows.
Well, that could be. You argue that either way, but
yeah.
I think I'm leaning toward the proper time. But I can remember back during the 60s, you had riots all the way through the day and nights and so on and so forth.
You're in your retirement. I've heard you, and with me, you've offered your own political commentary. I don't know if you have anything to say about what I said at the top of the show, but I think this president and even this governor, in forecasting justice for this family, created a lot of this momentum. The only justice that may have been felt last night is an indictment, and even an indictment heading into a trial may not have gotten a verdict. I mean, we've got a lot of big-time players affecting the dynamic here who seem to be out of the discourse on the behavior. In other words, they say what they have to say, and we don't think about the president and the governor having an impact on that behavior last night. But I think they set the boil.
You're absolutely right. Without getting political as to whether this particular president should have done what he did, or the governor, any high-level individual inserting themselves into the process of justice is wrong, because what you're doing is you're setting up a false expectation. The grand jury is not there to determine justice as far as a verdict is concerned, to determine whether he was guilty or not. It's a process that needs to eventually, either yes or no, go to a trial. That was not well articulated. But when you talk about the justice not being served, I think they could have both not said anything, or at least made an explanation of what the grand jury results meant. It is justice. The next step would have been either to a trial or not. Well, that is the justice.
The rhetoric from August on, the president intervened in this conversation 4 times prior to last night. The governor had his panties in a bundle a little bit about this whole thing, talking about the family. The politics of this caused, I think, an expectation that they couldn't deliver on, and the violence occurs, and you wonder why it happens. I don't know.
You're right.
Yeah.
But at
As
the
a
same-
career guy, I'm sure you rolled your eyes more than a few times over the politicians doing what they, while you had to execute a plan, and they were,
Exactly
going on.
right. I know firsthand that when you have a plan and you run it by those who are your supervisors, so to speak, or your elected officials, and they give you the blessing to exercise it, you get into it, and all of a sudden it's changed for some reason or other because of whatever reason. But I think here had to do with the insertion of politics, and that's my opinion certainly. But you can apply that to what's going on in the Middle East too. You can apply that to what went on in Vietnam. When you insert a political solution to a tactical military environment, you will always have this kind of divisiveness.
Speaking of the military, we have a little change at the top coming. Find out what the general thinks about that when we come back. Stay with us.
The appearance of President Obama and Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel was the final act in the kind of theater that takes place only in Washington. Even before the midterm elections, Hagel began talking to the president about his role in the final 2 years of the Obama presidency, all the while reading news stories based on anonymous sources that change was needed in the administration's national security team. After 3 meetings in which the president never asked Hagel to stay, the defense secretary, a veteran Washington politician, took the hint and submitted his resignation.
I guess tea leaves are easy to read eventually.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing the kind of ceremonial, perfunctory stuff that goes on? The announcement yesterday where the president was just on and on about what kind of a tremendous Secretary of Defense we have, and the partnership and the friendships, and much of which may be true. The truth is they were done with each other. They were done, right? Just done.
You're right. And the only thing that gives credence to that is apparently when we read books by Gates and Panetta, you see actually what went on. And there's no doubt in my mind that there was some significant divisiveness between President Obama and certainly Hagel as to how they should execute foreign policy and how it relates to whether in fact we can execute the remainder of the war in Afghanistan and whether we should bring troops home. But as we see that being announced by the president, we're going to get out of it, Afghanistan, no troops, no ground troops in Iraq, and certainly in Syria and Afghanistan, where you have the rest of the Mideast saying, you need to clarify your foreign policy, because the people that they deal with is between Kerry and the defense secretary is not in sync with what the president is saying. So when you have that divisiveness, I think you see the result is someone has to leave. In this particular case, it's not going to be the president.
It's not going to be the president, but how many secretaries of defense will we have by the time he's
4.
done? There will be 4.
First time since FDR.
Yeah, I mean, Hagel, for the most part, was an anti-Iraq guy, so there was some synergy between them there, a little symbiotic relationship. He is a Republican, which gave the president a good, between Gates prior to Panetta, having a couple of Republican secretaries of defense was probably a good optic for him. But clearly, there was just too much. Hagel, I'm sure, was, in fact, wrote that letter that really upset the president about what was going on in foreign policy, specifically what was going on with ISIS and kind of our pants around our ankles type of thing. I don't know what fixes it. Who comes in and fixes it?
You need, I wish I had that answer.
It's not Jack Reed.
Well, Jack Reed, in my opinion, I think he would be an excellent Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure that if the president came to him specifically and said, Senator, you need to be the Secretary of Defense, whether he would or not. I think he would. Whether he would volunteer for it or whether he would accept it in a roundabout way, I'm not sure that would happen. But if the president actually put it to him, I think he would be. But to answer the question, how does this happen? You need to, we as a people need to understand that when you see field commanders, and specifically the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, talking about possibility of ground troops, and you talk about your major commanders talking about ground troops, and the Secretary of Defense not taking them down to support the president, therein lies that divisiveness that I talked about. So I would think the president probably called him and said, Chuck, that's not what I want. Now, either you come on board or you need to step aside. And I do think that you'll probably see that in some future that would come out.
What to do to the rank and file?
The rank and file needs to understand that they're there with their lives in danger. The rank and file needs to understand that there's a purpose for them being there. They need to understand that you are totally committed to winning this war and to protect them the best you possibly can. Where they see divisiveness between their field commanders, the Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States, that's a scary proposition, and I think you see the morale reacting accordingly.
What to do?
To do is you need to come up with a workable policy. Either you win the war or you move out. There's no in between. Containing it is not workable. Winning it is possible, but there's a lot of consequences when you talk about winning a war. You talk about doing things that we're going to be criticized for, and a little example, not a little, but certainly one that's appropriate. Where you have the ISIS and the radicals and all of the extremists using civilians as shields, in order for you to take them out, unfortunately, you're going to have to take some civilians out with it. That would not be a popular decision, but it's a winnable situation where you need to do that.
All right. So the general says Jack Reed would be a good Secretary of State. Secretary of Defense. I agree. If he was told, he'd have to.
Yep.
I don't know if the president's got that kind of chutzpah. We'll see, right?
Well, he doesn't have any choices left.
One more thing. Stay with us. Good point. Interesting stuff there from the general suggesting that our U.S. Senator Jack Reed, if told he needed to be the Secretary of Defense, he would be. I think the local media's got to crash down on the senator and pose that to him. There was no way that Jack Reed was going to say, sure, I'd love that gig. He just got elected to a 6-year term. It's a pretty cozy job, too. We'll talk more about that on the radio at noon tomorrow on WPRO. We'll see you back here at 7:30 tomorrow night.